We're going to look at some ways you can do some watercolour washes, but first of all, let's look at some papers. Watercolour paper can be a bit confusing because it comes in different varieties. This one here is slightly textured and it's either called knot or rough pressed paper. This one is hot pressed and it's very smooth. This is very good for botanical painting or designing where you want sharp edges. This is Indian Khadi paper. These are quite hard to see. They're easier to see with paint on. This is made from cotton rags in India. Watercolour paper can be made of cotton and cellulose fibres from wood. Lots of people prefer cotton. That's the sort of top in their minds, but I think they're all fine to paint on. You can buy watercolour paper in sheets, in pads. It varies in thickness too. You can also buy these rather special watercolour blocks. So all around the edges is gummed, apart from one little bit where you can put a knife and slice off your painting once you've done it. The thing about these blocks is that the paper doesn't cockle. And there's a lovely big Arches one. Different papers, different brands of paper cost different amounts of money. And it's good to try different sorts. With paints, you can buy watercolour paints in a lovely little tin where you get either half pans, which are this size, or full pans, which are this size. These ones are made by a company called Rosa Gallery, which is based in Ukraine, and they are very reasonable and very good quality for the price. They release a lot of pigment and they're lovely and fine and bright colours. These ones are Winsor & Newton, a really well-known brand. Most watercolours are very transparent, but some of them, like a colour like this, which has got a bit of white in it. I also use tubes because if you're doing a large painting or if you're doing a sky and you want to have a lot of colour on a large bit of paper, it's easier to squirt out a bit of colour. I often use a plate or something that you can have a little dish of lovely loose colour. So, and with the tubes, it's fascinating to look all the colours you can get, and you can become expert in colour if you want. You can try out all the colours, you can see the mixes you can make. You can have a lot of fun just playing with the colours. So what I thought I'd do is just show you on these three different sorts of paper in a very simple way how to paint a watercolour wash. There are things about watercolour that is quite good to remember. Mostly they're transparent. You're using the white of the paper to make colours paler. The other thing to remember is that it's much easier to put dark colours over light colours. So sometimes if you're doing, say, a white building, you might put some masking fluid on it to save that area or keep the whiteness, or you might just paint around it. So first of all, for a watercolour wash, I'm not going to paint anything at this stage. I just want to show you the different sorts of paper and what you can do. So on one half of this bit of paper, I'm going to put some water. I've just put water all over. So what this is doing is soaking into the paper somewhat, and once it dries off a bit, well, not too much, it's ready to go really. I might take, another thing to think about is brushes, but I might take a brush of about That's about an inch brush. And take some of my dark colour. It's very green. We're going to have a green. I'll get some blue from this. Can you see how the colour blends very easily? And if you want to make that paler, just put a bit of water. If there's too much, well, if it's pooling on the edges, you can just take some of it off. Might put a bit of red up on the top here. While it's still wet, you can add some colour. And I could put some yellow at the bottom. It's amazing colour, isn't it? Just enjoy the colour. I think it's just incredible. You can almost see how it's going to be on the paper before you start. Can you see on here the colour is starting to break up a little bit as it's gone into the texture of the paper? This is called a rigger brush. It's long and thin. So it's still wet enough to work on this. So I'm going to just put as much as I can on. Let's just see what happens. So this is called painting wet on wet. Now I'm going to dry my brush off a bit so it's not picked up too much, and let's see what a fine line on here would look like. Now you can see that's still blurring out, but not as much as here because there's less water. There comes a stage when you really mustn't touch it. That's the thing to remember. This is getting rather beautiful here. This is too dry really. If I put wet paint on this area, you'll get what is called sort of a bloom or cauliflowers, which I don't like the name cauliflowers very much. You can do all sorts of interesting things with watercolour. This is a water-soluble graphite pen. This is amazing because it releases a lot of colour. You can also draw with it, and then you can actually release the colour with some water. See, that's interesting, isn't it? So now on this side I'm going to do a wash. I'm going to put a bit of red into that blue to take the it's rather greeny. So this is on dry paper. Let's see what happens with this. This is really deep, and you can see if I wet my brush now, let's get some really clean water on my brush. So I've got clean water, extra clean water. If I go up to that with that softened off from one dark colour to a paler colour, and you can go dark, you could put put some of that green in at the bottom. So that's on white paper, on dry paper, white dry watercolour paper. Can you see down there? That's quite fun, and it's quite a good technique to remember. If your brush is a bit lighter on the paper, you can actually leave little white speckles, especially if the paper's quite textured. See here, the graphite pencil, the watercolour wash pencil, has actually run into this area. What's really interesting is to see what happens. I do like this pencil because you can, you know, I'm looking outside my window and I can see some twiggy leaves, some winter branches. So, you know, drawing on top can be really good fun. There are some trees. I'm dipping it in the water just to see what happens. See how much darkness, dark colour can be. This is quite interesting, isn't it, here? Because what's happening is that the graphite stick is pushing away water. But it's so you can see what happens when you put watercolour onto typical watercolour paper that you can buy, which is called not. And it means it's not hot pressed or it's slightly textured. So I'll let that dry. I'm going to show you on this hot pressed paper. I think what we'll do is start off, we'll just do one, and we'll be a bit more measured this time, a bit more landscapey. So I'm going to choose in here, I'm going to choose a really lovely blue and put some of that this side here. See, that's probably enough for that. And I think I will wet the paper first. So I'm going to use my bigger flat brush. You can buy these brushes quite cheaply in packs. You can get really lovely wide ones, and they're not sable or anything special. They're synthetic fibres, but they work really well. They hold enough water. So I'm going to put water all over this. Start. I'm going to keep this really simple. So I'm actually going to use this brush. I've lifted. I quite like to really get a lot of paint on my brush. I sort of almost lift it. This is quite pale. And at this stage, if I want a bit more, I could use another brush. If I want a bit more depth. I'm not worried about the edge because I'm using wet. If I lift that, can you see that? It starts to run a bit, which is rather lovely, isn't it? I'm going to carry on using this size of brush. Drying my brush a bit. So I'm coming into another colour, and I've got some green here, which is quite deep. Quite a good colour. Should we just make a bit of a hill? I could make that even darker as it comes down. So I wouldn't do any more to that at this stage. Thing is not to fiddle. If I let that just dry, I know there's that sort of dip there, but I'm not worried about that. I might actually do some drawing over the top. I've actually got a dip pen here. I'm going to make this landscape up. While it's still wet, you can, to a certain extent, do a bit of work, a bit of painting. So these trees here, if you imagine those as trees, they're just running. I might put some, while it's still wet, I can do this. I might put some grasses. See, I'm just playing, and you know, if you can do this, this is how you really do learn. You'll find, sort of think a bit of a hedge there. Does that happen? I'll leave that one for the moment. So that one is drying. These are just experiments, just quite useful because it's exciting and that's what it's all about. You can actually just get a sense of play, fun and wonder. I've got some other pictures here. This is a lovely place that we like to go to called Thorswood, which isn't far from Ashbourne. I love this picture. Just wonder whether I could... That's quite fun, isn't it? That's quite simple. So let's have a look at that. That's very... not too much happening. So I'm looking at that picture and I'm going to put it over there so I can see properly. I'm going to use some of this blue again, this colour here. So I think that's the right sort of blue. We're going to try out this Indian Khadi paper. I'm going to wet the paper first. There's a bit of colour in my brush actually there, but I'm not worried about that. Because I'm going to go up to some grasses, I'm only wetting halfway down. See it there. Lift up the colour. It's more textured, this paper. You can see that, can't you? Often, as I'm going to put a bit of darkness in that bit, make it a bit more moody. Often, as we look into the landscape, as we look towards the horizon, we often get a lightening. Just taking off the lots of colour on the edge, which is pooling on the edge. I'm going to straighten that a little bit and wipe the table, board. So I'm just going to take some water off here and just make sure I've got a paler bit coming down to the edge. I'm going to get a bit of that blue neat as well and put just a little bit more. You have to experiment with things like this, but because the paper is wet underneath still, I can put a bit more on. Another thing you can do if you want to is take out colour for sky, for clouds. So if I really dry my brush out, I can either with the brush or got a bit of tissue. Just dab it off. There's no real rush when you're in control. And sometimes it does feel a little bit like you're racing against time, and you have, if you wet the paper first though, you actually do have a bit, you know, I'm just brushing it a bit so that what I wouldn't do now is go back into it. So I've got a horizon now here, but I want to get the feeling of this lovely bright grassy colour into the distance. So what I'm going to do is perhaps use some of the colours on this plate because I've got more or less the right sort of colour. A bit of that's too bright. You see, that's too bright, but I'm not going. And with this, I actually haven't wet the paper first, so you can see it's a different. What I'm doing is going up, and I'm leaving a really thin white line. Can you see there? I've got a bit of a problem there. So I think I'll just put a bit more colour on and hope for the best. That'll be all right. And on this bit here, I think I might just take out that. Put a bit of green. And what I've done here is actually start to think about the textures underneath at this stage. I think that's the sort of thing you can make use of in a painting. You can see the start of a landscape there, the start of some hills, loosely based on this landscape. This bit here has dried now, so I think what I do is get a nice fine brush like this. This is actually a number 14 size, so these round brushes come in sizes, and the others do. And that's dry enough now to work in too. So I think what I'm going to do is put a bit of distant horizon behind here. So you can see it's very easy now to overlay the colour you've already got. I'm keeping keeping this fairly simple, but there are some trees. Just some little trees. Just using a little bit of colour, and it's running. Can you see that? And then I think a little bit more of a greeny colour. There's colour in here, in this box. This colour here is called Naples. It's not very clean, is it? Naples yellow. And if I put a bit of that in with some orange, I'm going to get a slightly opaque colour, because the Naples yellow has what's called body colour in it. What I haven't got at this point is the sort of pinkiness around here. Usually I paint in the landscape and I find it much easier to do that. But having a photograph sometimes and working from that, or a series of photographs, and developing something that's not really real but has it has had a reference point to start from, can be a really lovely way to work. So I'm looking. There are some grasses that are sort of pushed. They're pushed a bit by the wind, and I wonder if I put a bit of this pinky red over the top of. It's a bit yuck. Just giving a little bit of red. So I think, oh, I don't like that much. I'll just take a bit of that off. But then I've taken too much off there. So I'll put some more back in there. More colour. What's happened here is that I put water on it with colour. Then I've dabbed it off and it's taken off the underneath. That's something to be aware of. But what I've got here I've also got a pencil, which is a wash pencil, which is a bit finer. Putting some more. It's dark, you can see. I think for the time being it's best to leave that one. Let's see what's happening with this one. That's dried enough to work on now, I think. So let's have a look at that one. I'd like to get the sky to have a bit more drama, so I'm going to put water back over the top. because this is on wet paper, that should just dry and not get runbacks or blooms or anything like that. So I'm going to leave that like that on the top. So further down, I like these trees, so I'm going to mix a bit of darkish colour. Now remember, with landscapes, when they're in the distance, you don't actually see too much detail. So see, this is wet. So I'm keeping that. Just a bit of a hedge going on. So this is called painting wet on wet. So it's all running and getting spidery edges. But you can clean those off to a certain extent if you just tickle them with your brush. So I'm not going to do any more to that now. I could, perhaps there's a little bit over here. So then what I'm looking at is the grasses. I'm going to actually use some gouache for the very pale ones at the end. But what I'm going to do now is look. Can you see how dark the colour is in between the grasses? What's interesting is that when you look down here, these pale grasses look very bright against the dark, and as they come up against the sky, they become darker than the sky, don't they? And that's quite an interesting thing to note. Something interesting is happening in this sky here. There's a sort of swish down. I like that. So I haven't practiced this picture or anything like that. I'm at the same stage as you would be if you were doing it. Just looking and seeing how things could be. This is slightly damp, but I'm going to just... There's a sort of... There are some darkish areas. What starts to happen is that you start to look at the spaces in between. I will put some see how that one's looking. Watercolour does tend to dry a little bit paler, so I'm going to let that one dry. So we're back to this. See? So what could I do to make that more exciting? I think it could do with some darkness in this area, and then this bit here would look light. The sky should have a little bit more menace in the top, just a little bit more. So that is just on dry. But you can see if I go below it with some water, I can soften off the edge. And if I go below it with some more water, hopefully not going to get any lines. Hope that looks better. Fiddling too much here. I'm going to get a line there. But you know, I don't mind it, so I'm going to put a bit more there. Don't mind that line. You can see I shouldn't have touched it, but it'll be what it is. I'm not going to worry about that. It's starting to get a bit more drama. What I feel now is that it needs a little more in the foreground. Quite like this darkness here, because that's pulling this area forward. So I'm going to get some of the, use the fact that this Naples yellow is rather opaque. I'm not going to do too much more now because this is really just a quick sketch. I was really looking at washes for the sky and how you can put in broad areas of colour to get going with something. And an interesting thing maybe at this stage would be to work a little bit on the negative spaces. So negative spaces are spaces in between things. So if you imagine some pale grasses, the negative spaces in between that often look rather dark, or dark leaves behind bright leaves, or the space all round a figure. If you can, with the grasses, if you can put some hints of stripes behind or in between some of the shapes, you start to get a feeling of the depth behind. So sometimes if you were painting or drawing, instead of drawing the lightness, you're drawing the darkness, if you know what I mean. It's a sort of find your way type approach that I'm taking, of course, because that's how I'm thinking. And of course, because I've been doing this for quite a while, there are things in my fingertips that come to me without me even thinking. It's a bit like driving, isn't it? And I could go on and on, but you know, and I'm not saying that this is worked very well or anything like that, but what I wanted to show you is that you don't need to worry, that playing can work. Perhaps a little bit dark, just a little bit of planning can work too. I'm going to put a little bit more in the top of this sky too, because I like the feeling of the sky coming over and pushing the horizon back. So I've not wet the paper. Oh yeah, that's nice. So I'm just going to blend that in with some clean water. I think that's okay. So I'm just having a look at this. I think what I need to do is even still put some chunks of darkish greens. I mean, obviously, I'm not painting a photograph. I mean, I don't want it to look like a photograph, because what would be the point? For me, anyway. I know there's a big fashion in, well, there always has been, the challenge of making sort of photorealistic artworks, but for me, I'm more about the feeling and interpretation. You can see in this area there a little bit of lightness starting to come forward. It's quite fun, I mean, to play with the stripes, because when I look into the photograph I can see something's getting in different directions now. It's going to be lovely when the summer comes and we can go into the meadow. Now I'm going to stop. We've had a look at doing washes, drawing over the top, wetting the paper first, so you get a beautiful gradation of colour, don't you? And I put lines over the top while the paint was still wet. And I also used this water-soluble graphite stick, which is very, very soft. It's 9B. We looked at this landscape. This could have a little bit more life in the foreground, I feel, but sometimes it's a matter of cropping. We darkened the sky. We tried to keep a lightness in the horizon. And this one, I think, needs more work, but I'm going to stop for now. It's a start, and it's just to show you that actually you can build up colour with watercolour. You can use a bit of gouache if you want over the top. You can easily do these washes, especially if you wet the paper first. Let it dry before you start fiddling with it, and then you can go back in and put more on. Actually, it might be good to actually darken this even more, I think, if I've got a bit more. You could take just that little bit more to, so I like it. Watercolour dries lighter, but I do like that sense of the darkening sky. So I've just put that on, and I'm just going to wet a bit more over there. I've got clean water now. I went and got some clean water. So I've wet into it. I've wet up to it. might just put a tiny bit of texture in. That'll do. We just let that dry. Now, see how it is. Thank you for watching.